Welcome everyone to Equanimity Forum. This is episode 3 with Dr. Gemma Newman, called Plant Power for Modern Health. So I believe, Gemma, we met for the first time at an event in London and started chatting about breathwork and other unconventional healing practices. I know you also have done training in Reiki, and it was really interesting to meet someone who, besides being a medical doctor, also has interest in lifestyle practices and other preventative approaches to health and well-being. And over the years, obviously, I've been experimenting with my own diet, and there's so much debate about what should you eat, what should you not eat, how you should do things. So it gets confusing, and I believe for a lot of people it can get confusing. So since meeting you, I always wanted to pick your brain, and now it's a perfect opportunity and excuse to talk to you. And yes, so could you please introduce yourself, and what does it mean to be plant power doctor?
Yeah, so thank you for that lovely mini introduction, Arta. My name is Gemma. I have been a doctor now for 16 years, and in all that time I have really sought to find ways to help people to help themselves. And over the years I began to realize that what I was able to offer them in terms of my medical training wasn't enough in terms of chronic disease management. We'd offer pills, and then people might get a bit better, they might not, and then we give them more pills, and then they might get a little bit better, they might not. And what I really wanted to be able to help people do was come back to health, come back to wellness, come back to themselves. And that's where my quest has always been. I knew I wanted to go into general practice from very early for that reason, because I wanted to get to know people and see them over time and encourage them over time and get to know their families, which is not so common in other specialties, and obviously not going to happen as much when you're in a hospital. So those are all the things that I'm really passionate about. Psychology, solution-focused approaches. And yes, I did train to do Jikiden Reiki, which I do practice, and I can talk about that as well if you want to. I don't tend to talk about that too much on my Instagram. I talk mostly in terms of things like plant-based nutrition, planetary health, holistic wellness, and all the things that are really that I'm passionate about. And more recently, this week, certainly, I've been talking a lot more about racial equality, which, some people might say that that's not relevant to my page and my website and all the things that I promote. But for me, it was really important to talk about today, this week especially, but also recognizing that it's something that really impacts health on a global scale. And people have with a white skin color don't always realize that, and that's something that I've been particularly keen to chat to you about today as well, given the events of the last week. So all sorts.
Yeah, there's so much, and definitely we are in a interesting time, and time to reflect, and time to recognize how we treat others, how we treat ourselves, and something I've been also talking about in my sessions as well, that we, regardless of skin color, race, nationality, we all have been mean to someone in our lives, to our friends, family, and sometimes it is a good time to take a hard look at ourselves and how we treat other people. And I think it's a tricky situation to navigate, and tricky conversation to be had when we are both European descendants, right? And
yeah, because that's it, because we're both white.
Yes.
And we have directly benefited from systems that have been designed to oppress people from other places. And that's how our countries have been so successful ultimately. So it's kind of a strange thing to navigate, because we're talking about generational hurt, which is something that we feel we can't take responsibility for, because that's something that we've been born into, just as others have been born into that disadvantage. But at the same time, looking within, as you say, is really important, because the lady in the park who kind of in Central Park, who first sort of sparked the first wave of this racial awareness, she would have she would have probably considered herself to be not a racist person.
Mm.
She probably never really thought that race, it probably never even occurred to her, because, you know, she hadn't really been affected by it. And then she clearly felt that she could use it in the moment of fear, in the moment of attack, or whatever you call what she did. She used it in an instant, and she used it instinctively, even though she probably never even thought about it before.
Yeah, and I must admit I haven't been thinking about it myself that much, and also because I come from Latvia, which is a small Soviet, post-Soviet country, and I grew up in, you know, in 90s, which country that was suffering from Soviet occupation, so still oppressed country. And so I think every culture, every society has some kind of trauma in us, and especially what's happening now, it all comes up, like inequality, injustice, and all those things. And it's yeah, it's interesting time to contemplate that and see how we might have been playing into all of that as well ourselves, knowingly or unknowingly. And
Yeah.
and for yourself, like all this interest and looking beyond your medical training, or was it your interest before you did your medical training, or after you've completed your medical training, you started looking into other practice, other approaches to keep us humans healthy on all different levels?
It's a little bit of both, Arta. I'm I was interested in religions for a long time
Mm.
before I even went to medical school. In fact, one of my A levels was religious studies, because for me, I wanted to deeply understand why people feel the way they feel, why people think the way they think, what drives people. Which is again relevant to this week and what's happening this week. Like, what is called, you know, what causes people to make the decisions that they make in their lives, and what causes people to make choices that could make them less well. And so yes, I studied psychology and religion before I went to medical school,
Mm.
as well as the mandatory chemistry and biology. but I would say that it weaved its way through my medical training as well in some ways. Like, I was always well into the practical aspect of medical school. I scored better on the patient facing modules than I did on the purely academic modules. And you know, I kind of went through med school, and the grades got better and better because it was much more applied
Right.
knowledge. And then when I went into practice, I knew I wanted to go into general practice, and that's where I started to learn about cognitive behavioral therapies,
Mm.
solution-focused brief therapeutic approaches, diet. You know, that was kind of one of the first times I thought, well, I need to start practicing what I preach in a way, because before I became a GP, and through my medical training and afterwards, I became quite unfit, and I had a high blood pressure. I was overweight, and I realized that, you know, much as I enjoyed reading and learning, sitting on my bum all day and not eating healthy foods wasn't doing me any favors. And I couldn't tell people to do things differently if I wasn't living that life. So that's when I started to look into ways where, you know, our lifestyles can impact our health even more acutely. So food, movement, and more recently, you know, holistic approaches and sleep. But yeah, at first I didn't have much in the way of understanding about nutrition, just in terms of things like nutritional deficiencies. And then when I was aiming to get to a healthy sort of body size, I just kind of absorbed societal expectations about what that meant, you know, cutting
Mm.
carbs. You know, I'd have a chicken salad and think I was doing great, and you know, I would just exercise a lot, and calories in versus calories out. You know, this was a kind of the mentality that I had around it at that time. And you know, I did manage to get to a healthy size. However, my cholesterol was still raised. You know, I was in my 20s, fit, healthy, you know, perfect health. I thought to myself, you know, I'll get my blood work done and I'll just prove to myself that I'm where I need to be. And I got the shock of my life when I had raised lipid profiles. My cholesterol and all of the proteins that are connected to the cholesterol and the other types of fats in the blood were raised,
Mm.
the unhealthy ones, not the healthy ones. And I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe this is just my genetic destiny, because I have a family history of heart disease. My grandfather died young of heart disease, and at the time I didn't know it back then, but sadly my father was going to have the same fate. He relatively recently he died. He was not even 60, he was 59,
Mm.
and he had a big heart attack and died. And so at the time I thought maybe I just have to live with it. But then, with more research, I discovered that there were ways to reverse that risk, and they were around the topic of plant-based nutrition. And so, long story short, I gave it a go, and I was able to bring my lipid profiles into the normal range after just 4 weeks of a plant-based diet, a healthy plant-based diet, and discovering those benefits for family members as well. My mum, she had recurrent dental abscesses that disappeared. She had arthritis pains that improved. Same with my mother-in-law, her arthritis pains improved.
Right.
And there's a lot of evidence to back that up. So I felt confident in terms of my own personal experience and in the experience of family and friends that I was able to give some decent advice to my patients around this topic, having researched it enough. And then that was when the real magic happened. People starting to get a lot of benefit from introducing a more plant-based approach to what they eat, which has been just magical to see.
That's amazing. And it's so amazing that you can do it because you don't just talk about it on social media. You didn't just do a nutritionist course or weekend certification. You actually a medical doctor who also has this holistic approach, which is amazing. So I think you have an amazing voice of authority to bring an attention to this issue that's oftentimes is not necessarily explored as because obviously we focus a lot about not necessarily about prevention but about curing the issues, but some of those things obviously could be prevented by food choices. And just to define the terms, what exactly means plant-based? How would you define plant-based nutrition?
So it's different depending on how far you want to take it. A plant-based diet is essentially one that focuses around plants.
Mhm.
But when people refer to a whole foods plant-based diet, they more specifically are referring to eating loads of really healthy foods close to nature. So fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes, essentially, with the addition of herbs and spices, nuts and seeds, which essentially encompasses all sorts of kinds of meals. So that doesn't sound like much, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes, but it can turn into an awful lot of kinds of foods. So you can have things like pancakes, plant-powered pancakes for breakfast, or a low-sugar granola and muesli with a plant-based milk and berries and seeds, or you could have like porridge oats, oatmeal, with seeds mixed in, nuts mixed in, berries, all that kind of stuff. So that's just breakfast, and you've got all sorts of different ideas. A plant-based smoothie, and then things like lunch. You could have kind of a burrito. You've got beans, guacamole, avocado, wholemeal toast. Instead of a chicken curry, you could have a chickpea curry. Instead of a beef bolognese, you could have like a 3-bean chili.
Yeah.
So you see, actually, when you break it down, you begin to realize actually there's probably quite a lot of my favorite meals that I could give a plant-based twist, and it would be actually potentially a lot more of a varied diet. Certainly lots of different kinds of cultural foods that can come in, which might not have considered before.
And it's quite simple as long as you avoid, I guess I'm sure you also advocate avoiding any processed foods, which are sometimes commonly that's an issue, right? The processed foods that are full of processed sugar, right? And
Yeah.
how are you, or what's your take on animal protein, for example? Do you advocate still having tiny bits of it or totally eliminating? Do you have a stance on it, or you kind of whatever people feel like?
So it depends on the person. I would say personally that an optimal diet does not have to include animal protein and may benefit from not having it.
Mm.
But there's no evidence to suggest that if you have a small amount of animal protein that it's going to give you a long-term negative health outcome. So it's a little bit of a mixture. There's a lot of data in the literature about some of the harms of animal protein
Yes.
when it comes to excess leucine, excess methionine, and cancer risk. When it comes to when you're heating the animal product, any kind of heating of meat can cause the production of heterocyclic amines, polyaromatic hydrocarbons. There's this molecule called New5GC, which is also carcinogenic. Then you've got the stomach bacteria and the gut bacteria that you use to digest the meat. And when you do digest it, there are certain compounds that are formed by your body called TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, which is again something which is, it's a substance that can worsen heart failure, worsen kidney failure, and increase risk of heart disease. So like when you look at all of those things, you think, okay, maybe it's best to just avoid it. Having said that, in some parts of the world, where people don't have every kind of food at their fingertips, then a small amount of an animal product may be a lifesaver. So, and again, there are lots of things in animal products that some people need if they have a nutritional issue, if they're in a place where they can't get foods that I'm talking about. So say, if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, then chances are you're actually going to have mostly plant-based diet anyway, but a little bit of animal protein here and there is probably going to be important for you, because you're not going to necessarily be able to get access to all the things that we can get in the Western world in the supermarket.
That makes sense. And you also mentioned gut health, and that also ties into what I often talk about is mental health. And I realize how oftentimes we can talk about meditation, yoga, exercise, and different things, but I recognize for myself, it's everything that the entirety of my lifestyle what I've been experimenting, what I've been learning. That's actually the practice. Like, it's not just the fact that I can meditate for 10 minutes in the morning, it fixes everything. It is the fact that I try to take care of my sleep and sleep a certain amount of time. I wake up on the same time in the morning. I try to eat mostly plants as well, and I try to exercise, and it's kind of all encompassing picture that is actually making a difference, not just one particular quick fix or biohack that we're looking. And you mentioned gut health, and that's also interesting that it also ties into our mental health, isn't it?
Yes, it really does. And the gut and the brain talk to each other quite extensively. And there are three main ways that they do that. So the first is through the vagus nerve, which runs from the medulla oblongata at the base of the brain all the way down to the intestine. And there are more afferent fibers going up from the intestine to the brain than the other way around. So definitely the intestine has more of an advantage when it comes to communication. The intestine is talking to the brain more from the vagus nerve than the other way around. And also through our immune system, there's a huge communication between the gut and the brain and how we feel. Most of the immune cells in our body live near the gut lining. About 80% of the immune cells reside in the sort of the gastrointestinal lymphatic tissue, the GOLT it's called. And that makes sense, because that's the first place that you're going to get foreign invaders coming in through your mouth, through your body, and you want to make sure that what you're taking in and what you're absorbing is going to be healthy for you. And that has a huge impact as well on your mental health, because it's one of the ways in which the immune system can communicate with the brain. And lastly, through the microbiome, if we have the right amount of gut bugs that are doing good things for us, they can create hormones, they can create signalers to the brain, they do create serotonin, in fact, and they also help to modulate dopamine. But I do think people probably talk a little bit too much about the role of serotonin specifically, because the serotonin that's produced in the gut doesn't actually cross the blood-brain barrier. But it does have important modulatory functions in the gut and for the immune system and for the parasympathetic nervous system, because remember, the brain is not the only place through which emotions are created in the body.
Yes.
It's also created through the hormones that are surging through. When we have adrenaline and cortisol surging through our bodies, that can also create emotions. And when we have them surging on a chronic basis, then that can lead to chronic inflammation, which is bad for our body and its processes. So it's all linked, it's all connected. It's not just about the mind and the brain. It's all linked together. And yeah, there are some pretty incredible gut bacteria that do a lot of that regulating for us. And when it's interesting because in terms of mental health, there's a whole new field called psychobiotics, which is all about how we can use the microbiome to actually improve mental health in the future. And we don't yet know exactly how that's going to work. But there has been research to say that it certainly works for things like metabolic processes. Like if you do a fecal transplant of somebody who is overweight and you give that to somebody who is a smaller weight, the smaller weight person can eat the same as they used to eat and they'll become obese. And so you can see, well, there's a huge role there to play in terms of the gut bacteria and what's happening in terms of the metabolism of that person. But yes, there are definitely a lot of things that we can learn about mental health and the microbiome. And also there's a lot of studies on food and mental health, which, although not specific to microbial health, is really interesting to talk about.
That's interesting, because that's actually what I wanted to ask you next about. Have you, because obviously we talk a lot about nutrition, how it affects our physical biomarkers, how it affects our body composition, but have you come across any studies specifically on mental health and how, or maybe also your anecdotal evidence with your patients and them switching onto more plant-based diet? Have you seen improvements in that sense?
I have. So there's a general sense of just feeling more at ease, feeling more at peace, which is completely anecdotal. But people have definitely said that they felt better mentally after having started a plant-based diet. And one of the ways I think that might happen is, well, there's a few ways. So first of all, it's a very anti-inflammatory way of eating. And inflammation can have a direct impact on oxidative stress, which can cause an impact on our mood. But also it's in the breakdown of something called homocysteine, which is an amino acid that is, again, it's in processed foods a lot and also in animal products. But we need 3 vitamins to break that down. We need vitamin B6, vitamin B12, and folate vitamin. And with a plant-based diet, you're going to have loads of folate, loads of vitamin B6. And everybody who's on an exclusively plant-based diet should be taking a B12 supplement. So in theory there, you've got these 3 vitamins in abundance, which will help you to break down homocysteine, which will also improve mental health. There's studies talking about the role of folate to improve mental health. There was a Taiwanese study on elderly Taiwanese people, and the more carotenoids they ate, the less depression they had. There was a great study, a randomized controlled trial done in America at an insurance company called Geico, and they gave people a plant-based education session, and they gave them the option of getting a plant-based meal at their cafeteria. And they didn't make them eat that food, by the way, and they could eat whatever they wanted to eat when they got home, but they had the education and they had the option. And what was amazing in that study was that they were able to, yes, improve their biomarkers. Yes, they're able to reduce their risk of diabetes, reduce their weight, reduce their lipids. But crucially, they were also able to massively improve well-being, depression and anxiety scores, and productivity in the workplace, which they had measured objectively throughout this course. So that really struck me as being something that I think is a really untapped area of diet and mood, and how it can actually improve productivity at work. And there was a big trial called the SMILES trial, which was done by, I think she's called Felicity Jacka. She's a well-known researcher in this field, and it was published in 2017, and they actually used diet instead of pharmaceutical or even psychological interventions for a group of patients. They got, I think, 67 participants, and one half of them, they fed a modified Mediterranean diet, which was full of vegetables and fruits and whole grains, predominantly, with a little bit of nuts, olive oil, a little bit of fish, stuff like that. And then the other half, they gave them psychological support and interventions.
Yeah.
And what was incredible is that within 3 months of the study, 1/3 of the diet group achieved remission from depression, compared to only 8% of the psychological intervention group.
That's amazing. That's pretty staggering, the results. And
Yeah, it is. It is amazing. You just don't. I mean, people don't really think of it enough, and I don't. I think it would be great if psychiatrists thought about this more, especially when we're treating people with mental illness.
and so yeah, it's so interesting. And also with recent situation with lockdown and everything, I guess people had to be more inside. They had to cook more for themselves and prepare their meals. So maybe there was hopefully some shift towards slightly more wholesome foods and cooking themselves in families. Has this lockdown situation changed anything within your family? Did you had to change your habits of cooking, or was just stayed the same as you normally would do?
Things are much the same in our house, other than the fact that we're just not going out.
Yes.
Apart from, I'm going to work. So yeah, no, we're still doing home cooked foods, and the kids are still eating a lot of home cooked foods, which is the same. I'm just eating out less at restaurants, which is probably better for me, although I'm snacking more, because I
Right.
tend to pop downstairs and grab a snack here and there, which I think probably balances things out somewhat.
Yes. And what would you, let's say, recommend for someone who's so used to having protein at every meal or having it as a central piece of a dish, how to start slowly moving into direction of plant-based? How to, because I really believe it's oftentimes the habits that are most difficult to break, right? People can know all the information, but how to start chipping away at that habit of having animal protein at every meal?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one for a lot of people, and it depends where your starting point is, but you don't have to rush it. You have to make it sustainable. So I think probably my top tip would just literally be to get a pen and paper and write down all your favorite meals that you like to eat, and then think about ways to make them more plant-based. And then you can, if you're ready to make a commitment to do that, then maybe just trying out one new recipe a week. And then most people rotate maybe 5, 6, probably maximum of 8 different meals that they tend to make on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. But if you're wanting to make a shift, then even learning one new recipe a week, then after just over a month, you'll probably have massively improved your repertoire. And you could start anywhere. Like maybe breakfast is a good place to start for a lot of
Mm.
people, where you don't have to think too much. If you've got something, if you can just fill up the cupboards with things that that you can eat during the week, and you haven't got to think about it. You can grab you grab your oatmeal, your porridge, grab your muesli, or your whatever you've made. Maybe you've made a granola, or maybe you've bought one. Get yourself a plant-based milk swap, get your fridge full of berries, and stock in a few nuts and seeds, and away you go. Maybe you just start out there with breakfast, and then when you're comfortable with that, you can
Mm.
start with the next meal and see how you get on. There's so many resources as well available online. You've got so many plant-based chefs now, and YouTube videos. If you are suffering from an inflammatory autoimmune disease or severe heart disease, especially, you may want to consider a whole foods plant-based no oil approach for a while and see if that works for you to improve the inflammation and things in your joints. And you can get loads of great whole food plant-based no oil recipes online as well. And you can use water or stock frying techniques for your onions, for your garlic, for your spices. And yeah, it creates a very similar texture in your mouth and a feel, and there's so many more flavors that you can add with extra spices. And you can get quite creative with it. You can add in harissa paste if you want to go Moroccan style. You can make Italian style bolognese. Yeah, it depends what you like.
Mm. That's cool. I think it's also for me personally, I've been changing up my diet, and over the last year, I've been eliminating pretty much all animal protein and kind of moving towards more plant-based enough. And it took a while for me to get used to the fact that I don't have a meat with my dish because I'm so used to it. But fair enough that now I'm so comfortable with it, so it's not a big deal anymore. It's just changing that initial habit was an issue, and learning something new, and I feel better. And that's simple as that. And I really believe once we start moving in the right direction, it becomes easier and easier.
What
And
made you start, Arthur? What made you start?
curiosity. I was, because it also made sense for me, like the fact that we should be eating unprocessed plants. That just makes sense, and obviously argument with totally eliminating any animal protein was like, I wasn't sure, but I was willing to try and kind of test out and see how it feels, because I've been always curious about diet and nutrition. And yeah, so that was primarily curiosity, and also the fact that all of this conversation actually makes sense about reducing inflammation, improving gut health, and getting more plants into your diet just logically made sense. And we also have questions. We have some time for questions. So those of you who are listening in live, you can put in the questions into Q&A section or in the comments. And there was one question, so I'll read out. It's from Sean, Sian. Not sure how to pronounce the name. How do we go about getting tests to show the levels of iron, cholesterol, not going through GP if possible, if that's possible at all too?
Sure. I mean, you can get any kind of blood test online that you want these days. You can do finger prick testing with private companies, so you can get all these different parameters that way. If you wanted to go through your doctor, you can also find out things like iron stores, hemoglobin, B12 levels, kidney function, liver function. Most people who switch over to a more plant-based diet don't need to do these preliminary blood tests. I think the main thing to be aware of if you're going to go completely plant-based is to make sure you have a good vitamin B12 supplement. I mean, the Vegan Society, they've got a dietitian and they put together this amazing supplement, which is the cheapest I found on the market, which is great, and it just covers all bases really, and it's only £6.60 for a 3-month supply, which is just really pennies. They've made it as affordable as possible because it's a charity, and you've got everything you could need in that little tablet there. You've got B12. I think they've even added stuff like a little bit of selenium, a little bit of iodine, some vitamin D. But the main things I'd say is with this latitude that we live in, even with the lightest skin tones, we can still end up with vitamin D deficiency because we just live much more of an indoor lifestyle. Yeah. And that's going to be something that's quite important to supplement. I mean, I would suggest pretty much anyone with a darker skin tone should supplement vitamin D all year round. But if you have a lighter skin tone and you spend a lot of time in the sun, then maybe only in the winter months. But I do think that's an important one for anyone, regardless of what you're eating. And another thing just to make sure of is that you're having a lot of omega-3s. So flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds and walnuts are all great sources of omega-3s, especially flax seeds, which have been shown in a couple of studies to also be great at reducing blood pressure, improving flexibility of our blood vessels. And just 1 or 2 tablespoons a day is a really great amount of flax seeds to help you convert the long chain omega-3s from there into the short chain omega-3s in the flax seeds to long chain ones that you could get from fish. If you are concerned about not getting ready-made long chain omega-3s that you can get from fish, then I would also recommend, if you want to try it, you can take an algae oil supplement. You know how sometimes people take fish oil supplements? Well, you could take an algae oil supplement instead, which is a purer form of EPA DHA. It comes directly from the algae that the fish eat, which is how the fish got their long chain omega-3s to start with. So it all comes from the bottom of the food chain, and that way you're also avoiding depletion of the fish in the sea, and you're avoiding any of the microplastics, heavy metals, dioxins, PCBs that have accumulated in the flesh and the fat of these fish over the generations because of the way that we've used the oceans.
That's awesome. That answers so many questions. I'll have to re-listen to this and take notes extensively for my own diet. That's amazing. And yeah, let's see if there's any other questions. And guys, if you're listening in, just drop in any questions.
And
And
also, you can look at I've got loads of questions and answers on my website, gemmanewman.com or plantpowerdoctor.com. There's sections on diabetes, there's sections on heart disease, there's sections on raising plant-based kids, there's section on holistic health. There's all sorts on there, and I've also put links to other websites that have got huge amounts of information, things you can learn under different disease topics. There's a section on arthritis. There's all sorts on there.
that's amazing. Thank you for providing that information. I've been looking at your website. There's so much, and I'll definitely add the website and your Instagram, where you put out quite a lot of content as well, and the show notes as well for people to check in and read more about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's so important that this is available to anyone who wants it, so that they can take control of their health again. And I'm feeling it so much more acutely at the moment, with this pandemic and the lockdown and all of the mental health issues that I think will come up from isolation away from loved ones, but also, all of the additional issues around people who have been delayed presentation with things like cancer, people who are not coming to the doctors with issues with their heart disease or their arthritis or all sorts of things. Now is the time, and even with the events of this week, where we're talking a lot more about how society is really stacked against people of color, Black people, but also just in general people that have not, people who haven't got the money to sort of always buy the best ingredients or the best foods. We need this information to be accessible to everybody. So yeah, all the information on my website is free, and you don't need to have a big budget for a healthy plant-based diet. These are staple foods across the world. Beans, lentils, brown rice, potatoes. These are like the basic staples of the most long-lived populations. People of Loma Linda, California, people of Okinawa in Japan, the Sardinians, people in Ikaria in Greece, all these blue zones where you've got the highest amount of people that live to 100. They're not all, they're not all people that go to the gym or spend a lot of money on food. They've just got a lifestyle where they eat mostly plant-based, if not entirely plant-based in the case of the Loma Lindans. They're active throughout the day. They've got strong family bonds and community bonds. So this stuff is available for everyone. And as I said at the beginning, I think the pandemic, as well as the race issues that have been highlighted from America recently, the world isn't a fair place. And I think that I know it doesn't sound directly related to plant-based nutrition, but I believe that it is, because when we are veering more towards a plant-based diet, we are able to not only support people in terms of their finances, because you can get these staples for a lot less money, but also to give to future generations more of a chance to have a planet that we would want to live on. We're not going to be destroying forest land and the trees for the sake of growing crops that we feed to animals that we then eat. There's going to be a lot more for other humans to eat, so hopefully a lot less in terms of things like world hunger and suffering on a global scale. So yeah, it is all kind of connected in if we join the dots.
It is, and it's so important to share that message that this plant-based eating doesn't have to be something expensive that you have at the fancy restaurant in London. It can be just, as you said, staples that you cook at home that you simply buy, and people have been eating for centuries, and they still eat that food in these blue zones, and they have excellent health. And it's just the fact that our cultural society set up that we supposedly need to have all this animal sourced protein that actually impacts our environment in a negative way. So that's so true, and definitely I think that's important information to share
Yeah.
with people.
I mean, have you heard of Dr. Milton Mills? He's a Black physician in America, and he talks about actually how he believes that dairy and the promotion of dairy is actually what he would describe as institutionalized racism,
Mm.
because he sees it as being Black people on the whole are a lot less dairy tolerant.
Of
And in
course,
fact,
yeah.
70-80% of the world population is lactose intolerant. And so why is it actually promoted as part of dietary guidelines when it potentially is increasing the risk of intolerance in these societies, in these communities, but also, it can contribute to things like diabetes and heart disease, which is, again, things that people of color will suffer from more. So, he has a really interesting perspective on this, which is something that I'd never really considered before he mentioned it.
And could you again spell his name so we can find him, or is there any way you would recommend finding him?
Yeah, so Dr. Milton Mills,
Yes.
and I don't know if he has a website, but if you could Google him, I'm sure there's going to be interviews that you can find. I met him at an event about 2 or 3 years ago. He was a delight. He's been in some movies. I think he was
All right.
he was in Cowspiracy, I think, or What the Health. I'm not sure. He was in one of
Right.
those two films talking about this idea. And also there's a campaign called Switch for Good, which is an American campaign run by Olympic cyclist Dotsie Bosch. And she talks about this issue. And in fact, there's a big campaign right now because America is choosing what their food guidelines are going to be imminently.
All right.
And they're trying to remove dairy as a necessity in the food guidelines, because in America a lot of the food guidelines are really industry influenced, whereas in Canada they're not. And in fact, if anyone's watching or listening and wants to know more about plant-based diets and how they fit into dietary guidelines, then just take a look at the Canadian food guidelines. They're completely independent of industry, and the plate is beautiful. They've got a vast an array of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and your protein sources do not have to be animal protein, and they have removed dairy as part of their dietary requirements. And if you're really interested in all of this, you can look up the planetary health guidelines, which are put together by leading nutritionists and nutritional researchers from around the globe. And they talk about the importance, especially in Western countries, of switching more towards a plant-based diet. And even the British Dietetic Association is talking about it now for sustainable health, the One Blue Dot campaign, and how people can try and make more of a switch towards plant-based or flexitarian kind of patterns of eating, because it's just so important for now and for the future.
That's amazing. That's exciting news. That's so cool to see that so many things are changing and happening.
Yeah.
And there's another question, and which is quite interesting. Do you think a cleanse is good before going plant-based?
Well, I don't know. That's the answer. It depends, because everybody's got a different idea about what a cleanse means.
Yeah.
Do you mean having a coffee enema? Do you mean drinking celery juice for 3 days? I don't know. But I don't see that it would be vital. I think the most important thing is to change your daily habits as much as you can over time. Something that you can really sustain, something that you can fit into your life and that you can feel good doing, day to day, week to week. And you're going to need ultimately to have a lot of fiber in your diet. I think most of us do, because a plant-based diet has a lot more fiber, which is great for us. We're generally fiber deficient usually, and we can get quite constipated if we're not on a more plant-based diet, and that can cause a lot of issues with regard to our microbial health, and also things like varicose veins and risk of diverticulitis, diverticulosis. So yeah, I think the plant-based approach is probably the best thing, rather than sort of cleanses,
Yes.
in my mind.
And I guess it makes sense, just consistent habits over quick fixes, right? That's
Yeah, I mean, I
probably
don't
it.
want to put it down. If you really want to do a cleanse, you do a cleanse. It's up to you. But yeah, if it's something that you feel you can fit into your life, then great. But otherwise, you don't have to do it.
Amazing. Amazing. I guess that's it. Thank you, Gemma. Thank you for taking your time and clarifying some of those things. It was been a real pleasure to learn from you, and I'm looking forward to diving deeper and reading more stuff on your website. And is there anywhere else that you could that we can learn from you apart from your website and Instagram or anything?
Well, I'm actually writing a book.
Oh,
In fact, yeah, that's going to be published by Ebury. So I really do look out for that, and put it on your Christmas list.
Amazing. So it's coming up the end of the year, or
Yeah, I think I don't know exactly when it's going to be released, but I'm hoping that if you can't get it for Christmas, then you should definitely get it for your for January, new year, new me kind of book. It's just, what it's got in it is stories about how patients have improved with plant-based nutrition. It's got all of the science. It's got chapters on things like diabetes, mental health, heart disease, cancer, but most importantly, it also talks about how you can put these things into your life in a really practical way, in a holistic way, bringing in the power of nature. So I've got chapters on sleep, movement, but also on the importance of being outside, the importance of sunlight, the importance of being around natural settings and how they can improve our mental health, and just psychological techniques that we can use to help boost our habits and our breath and all sorts. So it's going to be a one-stop shop for a healthier, happier you.
amazing. Thank you. I can't wait to read it. So thank you
Oh,
very much.
I hope you like it.
Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to those of you who have been listening in
Thank you,
live.
everybody. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you to everybody who's listening, and I hope you've learned something, and it's been great to spend the afternoon with you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Gemma.